After an eternity, the door opened. "Not today, thank you," said Father gruffly, and closed the door in my face. A second later it opened again, and Dad was laughing. It was good to share the old joke, like nothing had changed, and I had just come home from school on a Friday. We used to stay with Dad from Friday after school to Sunday evening, when we returned to Mum's. Dad gave me a big hug. "Good grief, look at the state of the old crony, dressed all in black with a grey beard like a bat out of hell. You'd better come in before the neighbours call the police." Whatever his faults, Dad always had a sense of humour, probably the Irish blood. I replied in a concerned Irish tone, himself is looking a bit decrepit and wants to sack the barber, motioning at his wild long grey hair. Without giving him time for riposte, I nodded at his oversized gut. "You are still eating for two, I see. You better face it, Mum's not coming back." "Yes, everyone abandons me," Dad replied with a mock sob and an accusatory look. Sometimes the border between humour and reality became blurred in the banter. Wonder why?" I battered back. "No idea, son. I'm such a mild character." As I stepped into the hall, my senses were bombarded by artworks in every corner. Just before I had left, Dad had started building his constructions out of rubbish. It had obviously become a habit. "Glad to see you've not been entirely idle then," I quipped. "Not as idle as you monks, anyway." Sometimes it was better just to concede the point, so I smiled. I focused on one work which contained a few objects I recognised, now transfigured, and mounted inside a glass case. Dad's old teddy, now wrapped in chains, an old drill, a small crucifix with Christ given a pink miniskirt, mounted on an office sign. "Bankruptcy and divorce this way." The back of the case was formed by planks of wood, beautifully weathered by the sea. It came to me suddenly the time we had gone to the coast to collect items for this particular project. The tide had just washed up a load of debris, and Dad had run up and down the beach like a child in a sweet shop. We got a few funny looks from the passengers on the metro, sitting there clutching our pile of rubbish, and found ourselves given a wide berth. "I'll show you the constructions later, son. Take off your rucksack and come and sit down. You look knackered. All that praying, I suppose. I'll get the kettle on." Dad motioned me into the front room and disappeared into the kitchen. The sofa of our childhood was still there, and I eased myself into it. The springs had long since sprung, and I sank deeply down almost to ground level, like disappearing into a black hole. That sofa served its time well. When we were children, Dad used to turn it upside down to create spaceship, wigwam, or time machine, as the game required. Sometimes Dad would put on a haunting melody by Bartok, which we used to call the witchy record, and we would be wizards in our coven, preparing deadly potions, chanting, "Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble." Dad would have to drink the poison and collapse on the ground, coughing and spluttering, clutching his chest, much to our amusement. Dad's armchair was also unchanged, in prime position next to the gas fire, the only source of heat. Glancing around the room now, I saw he still didn't have central heating. On especially cold days he would move his chair to one side slightly, to let us huddle around it. Some winters it was so cold that ice used to form on the inside of our bedroom window. On those mornings we would get on our clothes while still in bed, and run down to the living room fire. At bedtime we would get our pyjamas on next to the fire and run up to bed, where there would be hot water bottles waiting for us. John would put his by his feet, but I would hold mine tightly to my chest. Dad would tuck us in especially tightly with the blankets, in the days before quilts, and say, "Sleep tight?" To which we retorted, "Can't sleep loose in these beds." The coffee table was still there, a lovely deep mahogany inset with white patterned tiles, liberated from a building site where Dad was working. I could not resist crawling under it to examine the secret codes we had made there, at which point Dad walked in and exclaimed, "You needn't bother looking for money down there, son, I have none." "What are you doing anyway?" "Just checking the secret messages are still there," I laughed. "It was part of our spy game. Under the table was the prison cell, where we had to leave the codes for the next prisoner." The arrangement on the table was the same as ever. Radio Times opened at the correct day. Small pile of notepaper in neat order. Silver pen. Silver watch. Dictionary. Dad was certainly well ordered, a creature of habit. He disappeared again to get the tea. I didn't offer to help. Dad didn't like anyone else in the kitchen. They made it cluttered. My eyes wandered across the artworks. A model dummy's head with Mohican haircut, surrounded by broken watches inside a glass globe. An old vegetable box, a Buddha inside, facing away from the viewer, rejecting his followers. A large painting which looked like the inside of a cell. Cans and pieces of metal representing the DNA, mitochondria, and other cellular components. An elderly couple in green wood, joined at the hip, their faces at once childlike and tribal. I reflected that Dad's art was an accurate reflection of his philosophy, what he called the courage of his non-convictions, a seemingly random assemblage of rubbish which nobody else had any use for. Yet they also reflected a mind with great humour, searching for connections, with a sense of harmony and perspective. Each piece had a unity, and every part within had its place. On closer examination, the apparent chaos had a carefully constructed form. All the works taken together had a unity too. I had to admit that Dad had captured something of the essence of life. He came back in and set the tea on the table. One thing we did share was a preference for green over black. Cubes of cheese, 2 packets of ready salted crisps. Same as ever. Reassuringly constant. We sat in silence for a few moments, just looking at each other. Perhaps the hint of a tear in our eyes. I'm sure we both noticed how the other had aged. A few deeper lines carved out by life's scalpel. Dad opened. "They're not feeding you properly, son. You're as thin as a rake." I laughed. "Maybe we'll swap places for a few months then, and I'll take some of your weight." Dad looked at his belly and laughed. The doctor did tell me to cut down the fat, but I'm not bothered about eking life out. I'm ready to go when my time comes." "Are you planning on departing imminently then? Shall I call an ambulance?" "Doctor told me I have a dodgy heart valve. Offered me an op, but I don't want to end up with this stuffing knocked out of me, hobbling around some old folks' home. I'll take my chances." "You never mentioned it in your letters, Dad." He shrugged. "No point in worrying when you can't do anything." "Well, it's better to know. Less of a shock when you do pop off." "Thought you lot weren't shockable. Oh well, you know it now, don't you?" "I only just found out. I thought it could wait until you came. Better face to face, eh?" A pregnant pause. "Could be the last time we see each other." "Suppose so. Better behave then, hadn't we?" "Yeah. Sorry about last time, Mark. I just got too drunk. It was awful parting like that. I felt bad about it for a long time." "Well, all right. I'll let you off this time. You lost your temper. I know it's because you care. Thanks for the excuse, son. It will have to do. I scared off your mother, then you, then Hannah. I never told you the full story about her leaving, did I? She got right under my skin. I became too possessive. She felt smothered. One night we'd been drinking too much. We started arguing about something trivial, and she suddenly shouted, "I can't stand it any more. You're suffocating me, Patrick." Something snapped inside me. Next thing I knew, I had my hands around her neck. I came to myself just in time. After that, she couldn't go on. I couldn't argue with her conclusion, really. Dad was speaking in a broken voice, staring into his tea. She went back to her parents in Germany. We still speak on the phone sometimes, still best friends. We love each other, but it works best from a distance. I just have my cats now. They don't argue too much with me. I couldn't think of anything to say, so we sipped our tea in silence for a while. After some time, he asked me about life in the monastery. We talked of various things: gardening, cats, church architecture. Then he asked, "So, you're going to see your old mate Jake, eh?" I always said he was a waster, that no good would come of him. Never knew what you saw in him. I shrugged. We were looking for truth together, for a while. I knew he was a dilettante. No backbone, that lad. Dad was harsh sometimes, but I did not feel up to making the case for Jake. He continued, "I thought you lot weren't supposed to go anywhere. Surprised your boss man let you leave." So was I at first. As usual, he knew something. Wonder what he'd make of this lot. Dad indicated his works. He would get it. He would laugh, for sure. He's like you in many ways. No half measures. Well, I suppose I'm a bit like a monk without a monastery. A fish without a pond. Perhaps I should have been a monk, but I can't stand being told what to do or what to think. I found it hard to accept that you could. It's a paradox, Dad. We give up our external freedom to go here or there, eat this or that. But through this we escape the narrow bonds of the self. Your problem is that you've spent your whole life trying to reinvent the wheel. If you want to learn about biology, you ask someone who studied biology. If you want to learn about God, you ask someone who's prayed a lot. Dad snorted. I hate ready-made answers. You have to work it out for yourself. Anything less is second-hand. Do you need to invent your own alphabet before you speak? To build your own car before you drive? To build your own sewer before you flush the toilet? Isn't it just arrogance to think you will sort out the whole mystery of life by yourself? Dad bristled at the word arrogant. He retorted, "It's the church that's arrogant, claiming it's got it all sewn up." I paused and smiled, not wishing to escalate the discussion into a row. Maybe. But the first thing a monk is taught is that he knows nothing. He is in absolute darkness. God is a mystery. Perhaps this is something you share with us, that we seek the truth. Our way is not always a set of ready-made answers, but a method of looking. The church is the collective experience of those who have dedicated their lives to the search for truth. We stand on the shoulders of those who have found it. Do you really think it's wise to ignore that and start again from scratch? Dad leant forward to emphasize his point, looking hard into my eyes. But what if it's all a delusion, son? I remembered when I had said that to the elder. and found my reply in his face, which radiated truth. But it was only by seeing the face myself that I understood. How to communicate that? I fell back onto words. Who is more likely to be deluded, a huge body of people, including many of the finest minds in history, who have agreed on the basics over a 2,000-year period, or a lone seeker? My abbot tells me when I am wrong, which is frequently. Who tells you? Maybe there is no right or wrong. Fortunately, you don't live up to that philosophy, Dad. You do believe in good, even though you won't admit it. You've spent your whole life looking for meaning, yet are not sure it even exists. How would you even know you had found the truth you're looking for? By what criteria would you accept it? He smiled. His turn to de-escalate. Well, we won't sort that one out tonight, son. I better go and feed the cats. You'll want to freshen up, have a rest, and I'll start on the dinner. An overlodged ginger and white cat was rubbing itself against Dad's legs and meowing. I thought to myself, no, you won't ever sort that one out, will you? But thought it best to keep it to myself. Come on, I'll show you to your room. I collapsed onto the bed, suddenly feeling exhausted. My flight had landed in Newcastle at 9 a.m, and I'd been awake since the small hours. My sleep had been fitful anyway, strange dreams jumbling up my two lives, Geordie and monastic. The elder sitting in the Haymarket pub, talking to the bikers about the finer points of engine mechanics. Janice, the landlady of the Haymarket, transformed into a mermaid, sitting in a fishing boat with me near the monastery. The abbot teaching our physics lesson by painting a huge board with cosmic fractals, while old Mr. Moss drank his giant pint of beer. As I lay there, I found myself transported to an earlier time in this room. John and I were lying on our beds, the last dregs of sunlight creeping through that gap which always existed between the two curtains. It was about 7 p.m. Dad had sent us to bed early after one of his rages. John said in a shaky voice, "Are you scared?" I didn't reply for a long time, trying to find a few words of comfort for him. I settled for a lie. "No, I'm fine. Dad will be calmer by now, don't worry." No reply from John, so I said, "Shall I read you a comic?" "Don't you think it would disturb Dad?" "No, he's downstairs listening to music. He won't hear us." "Okay then." So I started reading one of our Warlord comics, a story about a battle-scarred hero deep behind enemy lines. But I read in a low whisper, just in case. After a while I heard John snoring lightly. He was asleep. Good. I continued to read silently to myself, until there was not enough light to see by. Thankfully, I had been transported away to some bunker with my fellow fighters, planning our dawn raid. I returned to the present and opened my eyes to see that I was lying on exactly the same bed. John's was there too, between my bed and the window. The beds even had the same spreads on them, pale blue candlewick with small raised squares. The dark oak headboards were still there, and the ancient blue gas fire attached to the old fireplace. The carpet had not changed either, thin pale grey. The artworks were new though. The ones in this room all had a nautical motif, more debris from our coastal trip. One was made of an especially fine piece of driftwood. I remembered it was quite a job to get the seaweed off it. a pale watery green in the centre, fading to a light, delicate blue at the edges. Dad had attached light orange fishing nets, a dark orange buoy, a bulging red rubber glove, a few sandy coloured pieces of linen, worn to white where the creases had been, a few rusty pieces of iron bolted on. The presence of time, many years of weathering by the sea, wearing down and shaping, like the effect of life on the mind. The elder once told me that a monk enters a monastery like a jagged stone, but he is smoothed out after many years in the monastic stream. Dad had as much chance of smoothing himself out as a stone out of water. Did he even accept the need to be smoothed out? Maybe he preferred his rough edges. He had once said that it is good for a man to have a temper, or people will walk all over him. That was one thing I could never agree with. Dad's rages made him impossible to live with. 2 wives had left him. Both sons had left with angry partings. Dad had thrown John out one stormy night, aged 15, because he put tomato sauce on the chips instead of brown. John had been forced to walk 5 miles across town to Mum's house and arrived soaked through. Mum was so angry she nearly went round to give Dad a good scolding, but John talked her out of it. He always hated conflict, my brother. I recalled once asking Dad why he got irritated with people, and him replying, "Because they're irritating." So, one sharp stone blames the others. No need to round off the edges. Just avoid the other ones. A universe of lone, jagged souls. My thoughts returned to Jake. Was he a lone soul? I pulled the letter out and started reading where I had left off, near the elder's cell. Tanya died 2 years ago. We had one of our huge rows. Her telling me to get a proper job, that she was sick of supporting both me and our son. I guess Bob told you about him. He's called Jeff. He's 17. Anyway, we'd been drinking too much and she rode off on the bike. She often went up to see her mate Wendy in Alston, to get away from me sometimes. I stayed up all night drinking. The doorbell went off in the small hours. Copper standing there. "Are you Jake Richards, sir?" I knew instantly something was wrong from the grim look on his face. "I am afraid I have some bad news for you." I couldn't face identifying the body. Bob went up for me. He told me later she came off at a hairpin going up to Alston, flung into the valley below. I sort of fell to pieces after that. Maybe that's why I got the cancer. But I guess the smoking didn't help. I should have been strong for Jeff, but I wasn't. He got sick of me drinking and moods and moved in with Tanya's mum on the Newcastle quayside. One of those posh new places with a balcony and all. I left the flat in town and came out to live here. It's cheap. I felt a great sadness envelop me, shed a tear for my old mate and for Tanya, and thought, there but for the grace of God go I. I saw the elder shaking his head and muttering, "What a mess." That was always his catchphrase whenever I used to discuss my former life with him. My thoughts turned to Tanya. What a mess her body must have been. A stupid end to such beauty. Her face came clearly to me as I got on my knees and prayed for her soul. Long black hair, slightly wavy, always the hint of a cheeky Irish smile in her green eyes and on her fulsome lips. I saw her shoulders shaking with a hearty laugh. always ready to give a sympathetic ear. The way she would lean forward and tilt her head slightly and look you right in the eye. I was captivated by her, but had no idea what to do with the relationship. It's not about blaming my parents, I know, but it feels like a part of my brain is missing, the part which knows how to manage a relationship. Trust, empathy. I suppose it was because of Tanya's kindly nature that I was so shocked to see her with Jake that night in the Haymarket. I think my faith in human nature snapped in that instant, only to be healed by my relationship with the elder. It was not so much what he said, but his very essence which healed, something about his ability to hold your whole being. The elder used to explain that each human is created in a pure image of God, but falls away from him, just as Adam did. Adam means man and refers to all of us. Our life task is to struggle to restore our true nature as children of God. In Christ, human nature and divine nature are united in one person. We are called to strive for nothing less. I forgave Tanya long ago. Indeed, I realized that there was nothing to forgive. The blame had been on my side. I had not treated her properly, and she had had every right to leave me. And what of her son, Jeff? To lose a mother at that age, and to be left with such a father, I seemed to feel the ground collapse under me, and prayed all the more fervently. My prayers were broken by Dad's voice. "Dinner's ready." Just like childhood, I summoned just enough energy to head downstairs. Dinner was a lovely vegetable hot pot. We munched in companionable silence until a cat limped in. This one's called Pushki, after Pushkin, Hannah's favourite poet. Pushki sniffed the food in his bowl, but turned up his nose in disdain. He's not been right lately," Dad sighed mournfully. "He's getting old. I took him to the vet, but he couldn't find anything wrong. Suppose it's old age, like me." I smiled and reached out a hand for the cat, who warmly nuzzled it and began purring. Dad continued. "We found him in the street one night in January. Chilled to the bone he was, so we brought him inside. It was love at first meow." Pushki jumped into my lap, which made it awkward to keep eating. I did not have the heart to unsettle the cat, and strained around it to get a spoonful of food. "You can see why the Egyptians worship cats, can't you? They seem to know something," Dad mused. "You always did prefer the Egyptian gods to ours, didn't you?" I laughed. After a pause, Dad replied in a serious tone. "Well, as a boy I did love Jesus. I dreamed of being martyred for him and sitting at his side in heaven. But I thought it was cruel of his father to send him to be crucified." "I can see that, but what if it was like this? The son loved his father so much that he offered to die for him, just like you longed to be martyred. No greater love has man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Dad looked thoughtful. "Maybe I saw my own father in the Holy Father. I was quite scared of Dad, you know. He flew into the most terrible rages. I suppose that's where I get my temper from. But I'm much calmer nowadays. I've reached a place where I'm happy with not knowing the answer." "And what does your question look like nowadays, Dad?" "Well, I've tried to write poetry these last few years. But trying to capture the essence of something is not easy. Words never quite nail the thing, but it's all we have, isn't it? I've destroyed 90% of the poems anyway. I did send you some, but you didn't say much about them. I suppose I reached the same conclusion as you, Dad. Hard to define the indefinable. Seems to me you have this idea that writing is a way to the truth. But isn't there something beyond words? He replied, words at least point to something, even if they don't capture it. Like the Zen masters said, the word moon indicates something about the moon, even though the word itself is not the moon. And when all the words are finished, we can see the gap which remains. But we only see the gap because of the words. I nodded. I don't disagree with that. We have something called apophatic theology, or the way of negation. We say everything we can about God and realize it does not come close to describing him. Stripping away all concepts, we plunge into the cloud of unknowing, where we may encounter God. I could live with that, Dad replied. Mind you, the Christian brothers didn't say much about unknowing. They were pretty damn keen on beating the facts into you. I gave a sympathetic nod and replied, but maybe the problem is not that they were too Christian, but they were not Christian enough. Jesus never hit anyone. I don't know, sighed Dad. In fairness, we were a wild lot. Maybe they felt they had to knock some sense into us. Civilization is not built only on polite niceties. Maybe fear has to be part of the mix. I've thought a lot about this recently. Maybe a price has to be paid for all this, indicating the television, the hi-fi and the other objects in the room. I am surprised to hear this, Dad. Sticking up for the Christian brothers at last? I don't know. Life is complicated, son. On that we can agree. What was this? I marvelled. Peace breaking out between us?